start. Lovely morning, everyone, and welcome to the NMC Practice Learning Review Workshop. Really pleased to be hosting this event today. I'm Ricky Hurley, Workforce and Equity Lead for Humber North Yorkshire LMNS. Also have Leslie Young here from the regional midwifery team, and we also have Jacqui Williams and her colleague Suma Das, who will be presenting today. Could we share the slides, please, Laurie? Thank you so much. Yep, so the
why
NMC...
can't I hear anything? What?
Hi, can we just have everyone on mute, please? Is that okay? Thank you so much. Yeah, so here today for the Practice Learning Review Workshop with Jacqui Williams and Suma Das. Next slide, please. Thanks, Laurie. This is just quite a kind of brief agenda for today. Jacqui and Summer will be setting the scene shortly with some details, and then we'll be going into breakout rooms. Laurie's kindly shared in the chat the Slido. If you can take some time just to make sure you're connected to Slido, and in the breakout rooms there'll be 3 questions, and we'd like you to interact with each other, but also to be able to pop as much detail on the Slido so we can capture all of your comments. And we'll have plenty of time after the breakout rooms for feedback, and then some further discussion from Jacqui and Suma until we come to the final comments at around about 12:20. And next slide, please. So I'll hand over to Jacqui and Suma to start the workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricky. Can I forward the slides? Whoops. Yeah, okay. I'll have to just ask when I need them forwarding. Thank you. So, as you know, we're in the midst of the Practice Learning Review, and Council approved that we would continue with this piece of work, and we have 5 Chloes, key lines of inquiry. But this workshop, particularly today, is looking at Chloe 4 for midwifery. I think it's fair to say that there is relationship across all the Chloes, and so briefly, if you're not perhaps so familiar with this, Chloe 1 is around reasonable adjustments. Chloe 2 is around the standards of supervision and assessment. Chloe 3 is around education quality assurance and developing metrics. And then Chloe 4, this is Chloe 4, and Chloe 5, we have nursing. But I know it's really hard sometimes to separate the issues and the points that you might want to make. So we're happy to receive any feedback, and we'll make sure that they're directed to the relevant Chloes if they're not specifically pertinent to this one. But this is the piece of work that Suma and I have been doing, looking at an evaluation of the key aspects of the midwifery curricula to understand midwifery students' practice learning experiences, including what works well and what could be improved. And what we want to understand how student midwives can best be supported to achieve their midwifery specific proficiencies, for example, a number of births. And it was interesting because we started from a position of very much a lack of evidence, and this has come out when we developed the new standards way back in 2018, publishing them in 2019, and then again when we did some work on the programme standards when we after leaving the EU. So we've needed to continue to see what evidence we can gather, and we're always really welcome to receive any further evidence that people might have. So these engagement sessions are really, really important because it means that we're talking to people who are really on the ground, working with student midwives, and really know what the sort of situation and potential issues are. There has been a few things that we have gathered. So, for example, we have a draft copy of what the EU is going to propose to discuss next year, which again is, although that's not finalised, it's been useful to sort of see what their thinking is. But we really had to start with a group of lead midwives for education to really sort of get some understanding of what we might need to explore in more detail. And that was really helpful. And since then, we've been working with a small group again of LMEs, practice education facilitators, student midwife and the Royal College of Midwives to really try to think about the direction of travel. And what we're going to talk about today is some early ideas and how things are emerging in terms of what we might put forward to council in terms of recommendations. So I think it's important to say nothing is set in stone. We're very much still in that discovery, collaborating with our stakeholders, working towards some recommendations for council to approve or not. Then there'll be an amount of work to do next year in terms of further engagement as we move forward, and a public consultation if we are suggesting we need to change or amend any add any standards. So really important that we talk to you at this time to help us sort of on this journey. Two things just to bear in mind: we are not looking at the proficiencies at the moment. That doesn't mean to say we won't in the future, but that is not in the scope of this piece of work. That's, we're very much looking at the programme standards for midwifery for this, Chloe. And I think the other thing to also mention is we're trying to think about what might be for us as the NMC, but what might also be for others within the sector. So I shall just pause just to see if Suma wants to come at this point, see if I've missed anything in the setting the scene.
No, it's fine, Jackie. Just to say about Chloe 1, we are looking at all protected characteristics, and reasonable adjustments, as many will know, comes under the protected characteristic of those with a disability, and we're looking at student retention. So just wanted to add that in, and then I'll come in shortly to talk a bit more about our standards methodology and how this work will contribute to the future when we come to reviewing the proficiencies. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Suma. And I think Suma's made a really important point, because we've done some recent work with some students, and there definitely is some confusion in the sector about what is absolutely reasonable adjustments and what might be more in relation to more flexible learning and what that might mean. And I'm sure that will come up in some of the discussions. So if I can move the slides on, please. So what we want to do at the moment is for you to tell us what is working well for student midwives in their maternity placements, what you'd like to see improved, and also importantly how you work collaboratively with your local AEI, because as you know 50% of the programme takes place in practice, and we expect this collaboration to work. So we'd be really interested to hear about your thoughts on that. So three questions to sort of think about. I think that it probably be that you will only just perhaps pick out your top one or two so that we get all the groups to contribute, and we will need somebody within the group to facilitate, please, because we're going to leave you to have that discussion so that you can have it openly and honestly. Okay, back to you, Ricky.
Thanks so much, Jackie and Suma. So we'll now allocate you into different rooms, and you've got 15 minutes or so. And then when you come back, as Jackie said, if you could feed back to the group, but also use Slido to capture all of your comments. And we will now allocate rooms.
Suma, we're going to stay put.
Okay. I should just let you know, Jackie, my internet is a bit iffy.
Okay.
So if I disappear, it's because of the internet.
On the feedback.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I've been keeping Ricky really busy while you've been in your rooms.
Steep learning curve on Slido and everything.
Okay, so if we could take some feedback perhaps about what's working well first, and I'll go with a different convention and ask somebody from group 4 to feedback. Should we take down the slides so we can see everybody? So somebody from group 4 to tell us about maybe one aspect of what's working well.
Sorry, Jackie, we don't know our group numbers.
Oh, that's interesting, Ricky.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it?
I do think the group numbers were there. They were definitely there, but I can't remember which group I was in because I didn't really look at it properly.
Okay, let's do it a different way. Let's have some. We've captured it on the Slido, so let's have some contributions from whoever wants to share the conversation about what's working well. Devon.
Hi, my name's Devon. I'm a nurse and midwifery workforce manager in NHS England. So I kind of kept out of the discussion, but wrote lots of things down that people were discussing. I guess one thing to mention is we didn't have the Slido link for the first 2 questions. So the Slido contribution from group 3 only includes the final question. So that's one thing to just mention.
So that's
I don't know
great. If you could send those notes through to Ricky, then she can sort of
absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So
some of the things that were mentioned in group 3 were it was felt that having a midwifery specific PLF or that type of role made a massive difference to collaborative working and being able to solve problems, and that sometimes when that was a nurse, there was additional challenges with solving the midwifery specific challenges that come into place in placements with midwifery learners. So that was one sort of shared view. And that there were some challenges in terms of how that looked when one university worked with lots of trusts, or the other way around, when one trust worked with multiple universities, and the different ways that looked. Yeah, I think the other comments I've probably got feed into the other two questions better. I don't know whether anyone else from our group wants to come in and elaborate on that, or.
Okay, I'll go to Catherine.
Hello. I think the positives that we were picking up on really was I think in spite of everything that's going on at the moment, the commitment of the staff, and also the fact that then reflects in the students who are so keen to be employed in the places where they were trained. I think that is a real reflection of the teams that are working on the shop floor. I think that is a really important thing to be considering within this. And also we were talking about specialist teams. We had a few members of the group who were within specialist teams, and how motivated students are to meet those teams, to see all the different roles. And again, that is sort of a testament to how well the teams work, and also that the majority of students are wanting to they're really wanting to learn, they're really wanting to find out more about those different roles. And then we were looking sort of similarly with the positives about how placement providers are happy to receive and respond to constructive feedback. Again, in spite of everything that's happening, there is a genuine desire to make the best of every situation, and staff in themselves, practice assessors, practice supervisors are, want to provide the best experience for the student as possible, and whether that's providing constructive feedback, whether that's sort of giving support to that student if there are problems, about providing an environment where a struggling student can succeed. All those things, that drive is always in there to be able to achieve that, or to attempt to achieve that as far as possible.
Right, Catherine.
That was
Before I forget,
first.
I'm hoping that there's a mechanism to praise that staff for that commitment, that feedback loop. Thank you. Eleanor.
Hi, thank you. So just a summary from our group, but I don't think from our group as well we managed to access the Slido, so I could send like a summary of this one if you want, because I don't think we contributed to the Slido. So from our group, there's quite a few. Some others have like student forum that is led by the lead PMA, so that's very useful, and student well-being support, where student will feel like they are in a safe environment to voice out. Some other area have had debrief, where student kind of like feedback that they feel supported following a challenging situation, and offering of like varied learning opportunities, different placement to maximize their learning opportunities. Regular meeting with AEIs and the clinical team to ensure there is early intervention in place for any concerns, collaborate and meet regularly. And somebody have mentioned the use of like the TRIM referral if needed. I don't know if there's anybody else from my group would like to add on to what I've listed. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Okay, so I think we'll move on to perhaps what's not working or what we would like to see improved. Anybody who happy to, as we don't know the groups, just chip in as you. Eleanor, yeah.
I could start again if nobody else is starting. So from our group, there was like a mention of like providing continuity with the practice supervisor. We acknowledge that the new NMC SSSA is encouraging people to work with different registrant, but at the same time, students' feedback kind of like saying that they would like a little bit of continuity, and that's added to one of our member of the group that says about use of supervision bubbles, whereas they allocate 5 or 6 practice supervisors and having them regularly. So it's going to be a less reintroduction to the new midwives and like getting used to the staff themselves. Then one thing we have discussed is like the lack of time of like the PA and the PS to do some time to spend on documentation, and we know that part of the like on the time and space for learning, one of them is allocated protected time, which I know everyone would love to, but it's at the moment it's a challenge and it's a wish list that no one knows yet how we could observe. So we're open for any suggestion how to mitigate that one, and so we could ensure that there is feedback on timely manners as well. So one that they did say that's kind of like good in one area that's probably could adopt with other practice, because particularly in our trust we don't do this. A student was given like a piece of like a time to do their own reflection on that one, so they'll do a reflective piece, and then at the end of that reflection the supervisor will be able to comment. So a bit of like the reverse side, rather than the supervisor providing the feedback to the student, it's the student having a reflection on that one and then for the supervisor to comment. So somebody else who've contributed in our group could probably expand that later. And providing safe environment, so the student will feel to be able to express, because most of the time, even if we have like student forums, it's a lack of engagement of the students, possibly because of like not prepared to kind of like to be called out and everything. So to ensure that we have a safe environment away from the clinical practice, that they'll be able to openly and honestly say their learning experience, then I think that's most of what I have to wrote down.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'll just respond to one of the points that you've made, particularly about the continuity of practice supervision. I think that we've heard that a lot. I think within the standards there is a standard that does talk about that continuity, although it doesn't specify it. But we do seem to have swung from a model of the mentorship to which talked about 40%, but that was actually a sign off, not a particular sign off, which is interesting. And then we seem to have swung the other way. So I think we definitely know that maybe that is something, an area that we do need to strengthen, because I think that aggravates the whole issue about supervisors wanting to sign them off or haven't worked with them and whatever. So I think that's a really important point. There's maybe some misinterpretation there. I think Diane's next.
Yeah, so just Eleanor was talking about kind of time for PS documentation and how much of a struggle that is, and we all feel that struggle, especially in the acute settings. One of the ways that we try and get around that a little bit is using a buddy system. So you'll have different PSs that are allocated students and they're buddied together the same way as they would be to cover workload for a break, for a meal break. So obviously from a patient safety perspective, it has to be at an appropriate time during kind of the work day, but you would kind of look after the workload of your clinical buddy so that they could provide their student documentation for 10 to 15 minutes and then they would kind of swap over with yourselves to do that.
And Diane, this is why these workshops are great, because now everybody's thinking, need to find out more about that buddy system. Because I think, as I said to you in the introduction, you know, we are thinking about what is for us, and maybe that's a good example, that continuity, maybe that needs to be more specific. But you've actually raised a great example of something that could be introduced to relieve some of these other issues. So that's great. Catherine.
Me again. So I think there was, well, within the discussion, there was a lot around sort of length of placement. And sometimes in some trusts, we're finding that partially because of placement capacity, partially because of an attempt to achieve proficiencies that have to occur in different areas. It meant that rather than students becoming sort of well rooted in particular placement areas where they've got familiarity, continuity, and all those kind of things with their practice supervisors, for example, you then get this focus more on almost a tick box mentality of, you know, rather than getting breadth, you're getting depth in terms of, you know, I know we're talking about proficiencies, but the ticking then becomes that it means that the proficiency and the knowledge and understanding and the depth loses its value. So that, you know, and even rather than, I think somebody was mentioning that some of the community placements in the first year create the real building blocks for good, strong, compassionate midwifery care, all those kind of things kind of then get lost in if students have got piecemeal, not having the consistency with the practice supervisors and flitting in and out. So I think that was really important to see how sort of the, as I say, placement capacity, for whatever reason, was impacting on really getting to grips with basic midwifery care. And then obviously that linked into the discussion over practice supervisors, which we're having already, which is that continuity, and you're mentioning about, you know, considering what might be the ideal number of practice supervisors, and they were trying to get it so that students had, again, probably that bubble, that core of practice supervisors for that student, so they're not having to kind of like reset, students aren't having to reset every time they meet a new member of the team, but somebody actually knows them and can, you know, help them to progress within the placement, rather than having to start again with each shift and not really developing. And I know then that comes into reasonable adjustments, and a lot of students, it's difficult to allocate them with reasonable adjustments because you know, they need these shifts, but practice supervisors work those shifts, and that in itself causes some continues to cause challenges as well. So yeah, I think that's, and obviously the births, the number of births came in again as you know, the normal vaginal birth is valued, and we understand that, but also that, you know, there are a lot of skills to be gained outside of that standard, outside of the 40 births.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Sarah.
Hi, I just wanted to reinforce what we discussed in our group about the background for PS consistency, or more support and evidence for it. That when we had mentorship, and I'm not trying to hark back to that, I love SSSA. When it works absolutely beautifully, but when it doesn't work, it can be really demoralizing for the students, because they're having to start from scratch, as a few people have already mentioned. But I think as well, for those clinical staff, with the feedback that we get, is that they don't have a vested interest in that student, because they're working with them for a shift or two, and it's that kind of interest, that responsibility that prompts clinicians, I guess, to be able to go the extra mile, which I know sounds awful and we don't get protected time, but to be able to provide that feedback, to provide that excellent learning environment. It would be great if that, I love that support bubble, that PS bubble, that sounds brilliant. I like that idea of having a smaller number that can then fully support that student through that programme would be great. And I think the interpretation currently is gone, like you say, too far the other way. So it was just to add a little bit more to that.
And Sarah, I must admit, I naively thought that everybody was so used to that they would just almost carry on but using that within the SSA, because I think there's been real confusion, because the only thing we've actually separated out is the assessment. We didn't really, there was no intention to dilute the supervision, but that seems to have what's happened. So I think there's definitely something there for us to think about and moving forward, because I think you're right to raise the investment, because the student doesn't want to keep talking through their learning needs, particularly if some of them are sensitive. And, you know, it's sort of a bit of human nature, isn't it? That if you're working with somebody, you want them to do well and support them. But if you just you haven't got that, you've got limited time with them, you haven't got the same vested interest. So really important point. Before we move on to the last one, does anybody want to come in on anything they'd like to see improved? Okay, so should we move to the how working collaboratively with the AEI is being shown? Sarah, is that a hand from before, a legacy hand, or? Yeah. So how is collaboration with the AEI showing itself?
I mean, Sarah, I can go again, because we definitely had this discussion at length in our... I think having different universities that feed into a trust, and also different trusts that support different universities, becomes a bonus rather than a challenge in some cases, because you can share lots of good practice. But, you know, the stuff on the Slido is exactly what is happening, I guess, in my experience. You know, regular meetings, you know, it can be a reasonable adjustment for a shift pattern to be able to just pick up a phone or drop an email and know that somebody's at the other end is responsive, and being able to pick that up. So having that working relationship with the PPF team makes a huge difference. We do weekly drop-ins for any member of staff. We do monthly stakeholder meetings where we all go. We do monthly full foundation trust meetings where, you know, it is a varied opportunity to, and it's all about relationship building. I think if you don't have the relationships with the organisations that you partner with, then you can't possibly work together. So I think in one respect, I don't think there's a lot to improve in that respect. I think there's always things that we can share and do things differently, of course, but I think that's a big thing that is working quite well in my experience.
Thank you. Ricky, can I go off script for a moment?
Absolutely, yeah, go for it.
Just to build on that. I mean, I think the one thing I'd like to sort of talk to you about is that there's a terrible rhetoric in the media at the moment about midwifery education being broken. And I'm not sure whether they're meaning midwifery education or whether they're actually referring to continuing professional development. But if we take it that there's unease and there is sort of concerns about preparation of the students for current midwifery practice, which I think sort of has come up already, but 50% of the programme takes place in practice. So whatever the students are taught in the university, there is still a requirement for the student to have continued, you know, learning and teaching on the shop floor, as it were, whilst they're experiencing those episodes of care. And then I think the other thing we're also hearing about is this failure to fail. And so I just really wanted to just sort of get your views on sort of what we're hearing, because if 50% of it is taking in practice, why as students, because I think we're confident in the proficiency, so why is the students not ready for practice, you know, qualified practice, and why is there this failure to fail? So Rachel, shout me down.
I'm not going to shout you down. Not going to shout you down, Jackie. My camera's not working, unfortunately. It was a minute ago. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I know a few of you on the call know who I am. So I work at University of Sheffield. I'm the lead midwife for education as well. So I'm absolutely not going to shout you down, Jackie, because I agree with everything that you just said. We've had quite a lot of pushback from students and PSs regionally around students can't do this, students can't do that, and we've said, oh well, actually you should be supporting them in practice, achieving skills such as even basic things like catheterization. You know, we can't in a university classroom setting, other than through a simulation model, teach you how to put on a catheter. However, that's not going to help when you're trying to catheterize, I don't know, during a Cat 1 section or something like that. So I absolutely agree with you that we give them the basic skills and they're to be built on in practice. I think a lot of the time is, even though the standards have been in a very long time now, there's still a lot of pushback along why do students have to suture, why do students have to cannulate? We've got preceptorship midwives that need to do this, yes, but they're qualified staff. Unless the students are supported in doing these, what we and I'm classing, I know you can't see my face, but I feel like I've trained with Florence. Unless we support students in doing these skills, they will not qualify and they will not become the preceptorship midwives. So I think there is for some staff, a lack of understanding about what the standards are, and sometimes they think it's university set, that we have decided that this is what your students should be doing. I've had pushback from staff saying, well, we don't agree with your programme. It's like, well, that's your prerogative, but actually it makes no difference. So we try and support, and I know there are staff on this call who recognise, we recognise that you've been extremely supportive to our students. So it's not everybody. The other thing around is around failure to fail. I really do think we need to work on this. We have had within my institution discussions with staff who say, I have concerns about this student, but they won't document it in their EMORA. And they'll come to us and talk about it, and it's like, well, you need to document it. Oh, and I don't want to. It's not really nice, is it? It's like, unless practice staff do that, we are really hamstrung as a university to be able to do anything about it. So I think this failure to fail, it's historic. When I worked as a lay ward band 7, when I was a clinical educator, it was there 20 years ago. But it is really important that because it could be catastrophic, and given the maternity services review that is pending, we don't want this to all unravel as well. I could talk about it for ages, Jackie, but I'm not going to. But I just wanted to put those couple of points over.
No, and I think what you're saying is absolutely right. That people sort of saying, well, it's because the universities, they want to make the money and they don't want this. Well, I mean, they've had the money, haven't they, at that sort of stage, if we're talking about towards the end of the programme. And it often is the third year, it seems to become really paramount whenever, the student has to put everything together. But process has to be followed. Otherwise, the students will, take to appeal and the university will uphold it. So process is absolutely key. Nicola, do come in.
I think there's a number of reasons for failure to fail. I think continuity. So if they're not working with the same supervisors regularly and it's just one supervisor each shift, the concerns are not being identified. Supervisors are missing things because the students are very adept at maneuvering. I don't know if that's the right word, but being able to sneak under that radar. So I think continuity would improve, and people would be able to identify when students are not achieving the levels that they should be at their stage of learning. I also think that the demands on the workforce at the moment, we've become adept at completing tasks, and we're teaching students how to complete tasks. We're not educating them on why we're doing those tasks and what the complexities are and why we need to do these things. So I think the students are being failed. They're not being educated. So when they do become qualified, again, they're just doing tasks, but they're not understanding why and the implications. And maybe that's then leading to them not escalating when there's an issue because they don't understand that issue. There was something else, but it's gone out of my head, menopause brain. So I'm sure I'll contribute again when it comes back to me.
Don't worry, Nicola, we'll put it in the chat. And I was just picking up a point that Leslie has raised that Devon's done. Oh, it's disappeared. Devon has done some work around midwives around the UK so that the PSs really understand the programme, the curriculum, and
it's work with international midwives. Devon's on the call, so I can let him come in and tell you. We've just been having a conversation.
Yes,
yeah,
I do
international.
That.
Goodness knows what I've typed, Jacqui. Goodness knows. But Devon's on the call.
But I think you've raised a really important point, because we've heard whereby a lot of the preparation of the practice supervisors, the AEIs, are absent. Now, that always puzzles me, because actually the AEIs need to be absolutely in there to support that training and continuing development, so that they understand the curriculum, understand why it's put together, and understand changes or get feedback for when they want to maybe do changes. So I think this is where I was sort of getting at, that collaborative working has to be at all levels, but particularly with the practice supervisors. Drew, do come in.
Thank you. A couple of points, Drew. I think just on that point you've just mentioned, certainly here at our university at York, we do supervisor preparation for third years in line with the requirements. But in terms of assessor preparations and support, us as a university, and a lot of universities at the moment are going through massive challenges with resources, and having the ability to actually contribute in a meaningful way is harder than it's probably ever been. And it's I understand what you're saying, but we need to be involved in that. But logistically, it's actually really, really challenging. And our midwifery team here is understaffed in terms of the staffing that we should have versus what we have. It becomes very difficult to support engagement with that. And that is a general challenge, I think, for AEIs. The point I was actually raising my hand about was more around the failure to fail, which I think has obviously been an ongoing issue for a long time. Part of the reason why we moved to the SSSA. I'm looking at this very broadly from my role as Director of Practice Learning, and that's for all professions at our university, not just midwifery. And I will preface it by saying that I hold eMoira in really high regard in terms of its clarity and the Moira document. In terms of its depth and the detail that's in there, I think there's a lot of things it gets a lot better than other professions. One area where I think it falls a little bit shorter, and because I don't want this to be all about pinning failure to fail on practice, I don't think that delves into the real core of the issue. That's part of it, but I think the documentation and AEIs can sometimes not facilitate that process as well. It's not a one-sided street in terms of the failure to fail. And where eMoira gets it slightly wrong for me in terms of comparisons to other professions is that other professions really clearly have very, very obvious professional value sections that are regularly assessed separately. And that isn't present in the EMOIRA in the same way. And from my experience, looking at all the professions, most of the issues in practice fall under that professional section. Sometimes it's about skill, and sometimes it's about recognizing your scope of competence and acting outside of that. That's absolutely true. But more often than not, it's behaviors and attitudes that are causing the problems that are being flagged. And in other professions, it's really easy to identify that and really easy to pass or fail students. Whereas the EMOIRA doesn't quite get that professional values discussion as good as other professions for me. And I think it is a complicating factor for practice to kind of follow that process. It's harder to navigate, and I wonder how much, you know, I just don't think it's fair just to push it all onto practice and say that, you know, it's a failure to fail, when actually the processes are harder to follow for midwifery, for professional values, certainly, in my opinion, than other professions. And is there anything we can do about that?
Really, really good insights, Drew. And I think I was a university, one of the universities has actually developed something which actually is almost like an addition. But I think, yes, that's something that really does need, and hopefully when I go to the sort of the next steps and things I want to share with you, it's going to pick up some of that assessment concerns that you have. So thank you for that.
I do really think EMOIRA is great. You know, I do.
Yeah.
It's not a criticism of that, because I think as a document, it's a real positive. But we can always look at things to try and improve.
Yeah. Thank you. Fran. Oh, can't. I think you're still on mute, Fran.
Oh, sorry. I'm from the University of Hull. I agree with everything Drew just said in terms of the pressures, and also how university processes don't necessarily allow us to fail people very easily. There's the pressure from the university point of view is to support students to get through the course, and we've found we're having to bring students to go through the fitness to practice process in order to fail them, because the university systems are to allow people additional attempts and to do everything we can to facilitate their progression. So there is that conflict almost, and it's something that we probably need to look at, certainly from an individual university point of view, but maybe as a wider group, as to how we can navigate that. So just to agree with what
Fran, could I just unpick that a little bit? Because obviously I can understand there might be some real challenges with the professional thing, because that would have to go through fitness to practice. But I'm thinking more about students really that are not meeting those proficiencies. Are you saying that the processes are not helping practice supervisors to fail on proficiencies?
Well, with our programme, because we're looking at them completing the EMOIRA over the course of a year, they're not getting assessed from a university completing a module point of view until the end of the academic year. So we can't fail them essentially until the end of the academic year.
With you. Oh yeah, fair enough. Yeah. And a lot of, actually, to be fair, a lot of midwifery programs are like that they have year-long practice placements. Yeah, that's fine. Ricky, I'm looking at the time. I'm just wondering if
Jacqui, I was going to say, can we just bring Devon in just to give some more detail about the work she's done before we move on? Would that be okay?
And then I think we probably need to move on, because I want to sort of obviously share with where some of our thinking.
Is it okay, Devon?
I'll briefly touch on it. I guess we acknowledge that some of our internationally educated midwives didn't have necessarily have the background information about what UK midwifery education looked like to support them to be able to supervise and assess effectively. So we worked with a university to put on some webinars, but I think what Leslie was touching on was more of, actually, when we think about it, are we confident that all of our midwifery colleagues who are supervising and assessing have insight into the current midwifery education and what the students that they're supervising and assessing are being taught, or what their current curriculum looks like? And the conversation was that maybe not, especially maybe for some of those midwives who've been in practice longer. And it was just a conversation that Leslie and I had with some other individuals about maybe sometimes that's a bit of a barrier, but I think it links back, Jackie, to what you were saying about preparation to supervise and assess, universities being present, and then what Drew touched on as well, that there's massive pressures there in terms of ability to be involved. So I think it's potentially gone around in a big circle. But yeah, it has worked for that group, and maybe it's something that we need to think about, Leslie, from a regional perspective around is there something we can do to support our existing workforce to better understand what student midwives are having from a university perspective.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up also on Ricky Lee's point about attendance at university. I mean, I know that the LMEs have shared with me this challenge. I mean, they still have to meet the 2,300 hours minimum. And, you know, this whole, we don't specifically state attendance because you can get your theory, but, you know, ultimately they must have that underpinning knowledge, which would be borne out through their assessments, but also within their practice assessments. Shall I just take Nicola as the last point before we move to?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on the universities, and our trust works alongside 2 different universities, and the structure of their clinical and non-clinical time is vastly different. And one of the universities, the students are finished by the end of July, if not earlier. And the other university, they're still doing the previous year in September. And it seems that they do the same amount of hours, but it just seems more fractured from one university. And they've even recently changed their program and how they deliver it and the times and the clinical placements, but it still seems really fractured and so different to the other university. And I just don't understand how they can be so different when they're working from the same thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I mean, obviously they are approved, and because our standards are outcome focused, it gives the universities the ability to develop their own program in an innovative way, obviously often in a competitive way as well. I think it's very interesting, though, that point. I had a student recently talk to me about the fact she was all finished, which really surprised me. She's got all her births, she's finished. So I said, well, what are you doing? She said, I've been put on leave. I said, oh, okay then. But, you know, you think that student then has not got no placement from something like June, maybe right through to November, if that's when she starts her first post. Now, that's interesting for me about how she maintains that proficiency. Now, I'm not talking about that she needs to work all the way, but that I think is quite interesting for me about what she's then going to need in the preceptorship period. Okay, Rachel, is your point around this? Because I'm just sort of really...
Yeah, it was just around sort of clarification from an AEI perspective and how we thought, you know, how often programs are different. As what you explained, Jackie, it's and it's interesting why you might think that program's fractured, and have you fed that back? Because actually, from a clinician's point of view, not understanding potentially how a university sets up the program, in terms of students doing hours, and this building on your point, Jackie, it could be placement capacity, that they don't now have the capacity to put the students in right the way up until the end, because there are so many students struggling to achieve, particularly intrapartum care. So we work very closely with the other HI in our region. We have to do opposite placements often so we can stretch the capacity. So it might appear that a program is fractured because it doesn't run the same as the other program. However, if it ran the same as in my case, if my placements ran exactly the same time as the other placements, you would have twice as many students in the placement area at the same time. So maybe feed that back to the HEI, Nicola, and say actually why you think it's a challenge, because we are always keen to hear from practice placement providers around how you can make it better, but often the way that the programs are set up are there for a reason, and you know, and it's often to do with capacity and trying to where we put the placements now in a very reducing circuit, I think.
I think that feedback, and I was going to say, Nicola, that feedback also in terms of what does that mean for those students and their preceptorship needs, about whether you're seeing that they have more needs or less, you know, it's collecting that data and that feedback loop, which is so important.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, but the recent changes to one curriculum has made it more difficult for allocations of placements, because both universities are now out at the same time, and there's a lot more students out at the same time, and so it makes it difficult. But it was changed to try and improve the blocks of clinical placements and to make sure the students were having more time rather than it being broken up and like in university for 3 weeks and then out for 4 weeks and then back in for 2 weeks, etc. And that might not be the case. I'm just picking out numbers there, but it has made it more difficult to try and get the two universities in placement because they're overlapping so much now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. So if we go back to the slides, Jackie, Laura, is it okay if we can go to slide 7, please? Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
So unfortunately, Suma's internet has dropped out completely, so she hasn't been able to return. But I think this slide, and you'll get the slide, so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's just so you know that we have a standards development methodology. It needs to be thinking about equality throughout, so an impact assessment is always done. It allows us to step off and step back on again if new things come, new developments, new literature, and obviously there is a review cycle that continues. So hopefully that will give you sort of some reassurance. But I think what is really critical is that all this is co-produced with our key stakeholders. And particularly for midwifery, as I said right at the beginning, there's a lack of evidence, you know, in terms of what, you know, a lot of it is custom and practice. We know that the rest of the world and the EU, you know, often are still adopting similar approaches. But it's so that it's a bit, sometimes it's about building consensus in the lack of evidence as well. Thank you. If I could have the next slide. So when we've talked to our stakeholders, we've reminded them about the various aspects within the practice learning section of the programme standards that our students midwives must achieve. So I would think that none of those are particularly new to you, but I think it's very clear that the issue around the numerical assessed proficiencies is the one that probably is the one that's sort of we've concentrated the most, because a lot of the other things they seem to be able to meet in without too many challenges. Thank you, Ricky. For the next slide. So this is where we've sort of honed things down, I suppose. We've really feel now we need a definition of practice learning, and this will be across nursing and midwifery. We define what a practice learning partner is, but we don't define practice learning, and I think that's going to be really, really important. And that then links with this whole discussion about hours and particularly simulation. Now, we're not hearing an awful lot about really mirroring what nursing is doing for simulation, but I think we recognise that simulation is used in midwifery, but maybe with this definition of practice learning, it might sort things out a little bit in terms of how simulation is viewed and counted within the midwifery curriculum. So when I talked about that evidence, what we've done is we've developed like a principles paper from the discussions to see where we want to go next with it. But it is interesting. There's absolutely no appetite for the 600 hours within the programme, like nursing, which is interesting. But I think what is in absolute agreement is we need to have a refocus. Now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite to drop the EU directive wholesale, because people recognise that whilst there's not an evidence-based, it's a useful measure. But I think that the thinking is they want to refocus on it. So what this would sort of mean, and the idea is that, and this is very early thinking, is that once a student reached 30 births, they would have a review of what they still need for their learning as they move. And this is likely to be in the final year of the practice, not just to meet proficiency, but also to develop confidence within their practice. And I think this ties up really well with what we've been talking about at the moment around this continuity of supervision, because it will mean this assessment will need to be done so that the supervisors can really think about what learning opportunities they need going forward. So for some students, it might be something more complex. For others, it might be more in terms of physiological births, home births, or water births, or whatever. But it's and I think the reason, one of the things that sort of clicked with me is that at the moment, for the few students that are put through on that 30/20 caveat, they are rigorously assessed for their learning needs. Whereas at the moment, we've potentially got students signing off numbers, but actually, has anybody really looked at what their experience is and what they need going forward? And then the idea will be, once that is done, there will be a holistic assessment. And I think that picks up a little bit on what Drew was saying, really, that there might be a load of proficiencies, but where does it all come together? How is that whole holistic assessment done? And of course, it won't be just for the birth itself, but it will also be for care and labour. And I think that will mean that maybe students would have some formative opportunities to do this. There would be discussion, because it isn't just 30 or 40, it's 31 to 39, if you like, anything in between. So students would be really on a sort of like a journey as to at what point they would do this assessment. Now, this assessment would need to be developed. I mean, the most likely place would be within the MORA and the equivalents in Scotland and Wales. And but I think it feels that that's a much more pragmatic approach than just purely going for the numbers, although the numbers, so it's a refocus, if you like, with the numbers still sort of underpinning. And I think there is something around also providing continuity of care and carer for women and babies, and how that might fit in to all of this as well. I can't remember what the next slide is actually, right, Ricky?
Just a conversation around next steps, Jacqui.
I'll just pause, actually, just in case there's any immediate responses to that. As I say, it's very early thinking. We're developing a paper around that as to what all of this would mean. But I think it feels fairly pragmatic in terms of addressing some of the challenges. Sarah.
Hi, I just wanted to highlight, and I don't know whether this is an issue across all of our area, organisations, but one of the biggest challenges we've got is not just the number of normal physiological births, which we know are declining, but actually the number of vaginal births. So when we're looking for students who have that 30/20, and I think at first we thought it was maybe a concern that the students just weren't documenting them properly, because there has been a bit of a grey area around that in the past. But actually, when we talk to the students, they haven't always had a lot of vaginal experiences supporting women and where they're not conducting the birth. And I think when we've got in some areas a caesarean section rate that's close to 50%, if not over in some cases, then actually the number of vaginal experiences the students are being exposed to is starting to reduce, and that's even further compounded when we've got high saturation of students.
Yeah,
and I think
you're absolutely right, Sarah. And I think that is one of the first things, very rough and ready calculation can tell you whether you've got your numbers right for that particular unit by, you know, working out how, you know, a 50% rate of, say, section and whatever, and you can work out how many births, you know, broadly the students need, and you could soon see if it's at odds. And I think there is definitely a review about that throughput of students now, and also throughput throughout the week, so that you're not getting, so one area was talking about they had a scheme that's called no more than 2, because they'd worked out that was the maximum number of shifts they could have on any one time on the delivery suite. And it really was, although it sounds obvious, I think it was helpful to have that thinking, but also demonstrate to the students why you can't just keep, you know, changing off duty. And, you know, I've had one student recently tell me that she's turned up and there's more students than midwives. You know, they're not going to get the experience, are they? But I do think that we've got to be very careful about this, because obviously we've got, you know, the eyes are on maternity. We must be careful not to dilute the standards in the eyes of the public perception. And I think as well, ensuring that, you know, we're playing the part in addressing all of this, you know, because 50% section rate, which is higher than America, just can't be right. And I think we've got the professors of midwifery really looking at the evidence to this to say, what are we doing, you know? So I think it's all of these challenges. I think that's probably what I'm trying to say. But, you know, really important points, Sarah.
Yeah, and it's like trying to explain to first year students who don't know any different why, when they do cesarean sections, they don't really need to document it anywhere as far as their regulations.
They can document it in the complications, because that's in additional needs. So there is places for them to document, and it's important they get that exposure. But that's why I think this reset and thinking about, right, what do these individuals, you know, to really think about what sort of aspects of care they need during that final year could be helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Fran, do come in.
I suppose I'm immediately thinking about the practicalities of this and what it means in terms of facilitating. What is absolutely agree with the approach to have a, you know, more holistic approach and look at what that student's learning needs, but in terms of us actually being able to facilitate that, it assumes a certain, well, it assumes we've got the availability of the practice assessors, and actually often arranging those reviews can be really challenging. Just finding a time and date that all 3 of us can do can be really challenging, or even just the student and the assessor.
Yeah.
So I'm concerned about the burden on staff for that, but also in terms of the flexibility of the programme and us being able to provide the experiences the students need. I know we've had students going to 3rd year telling us they've never done intermittent auscultation before, because every woman they've looked after has been on a CTG. So we know that they're going to get to that review and they're all going to tell us they want more physiological birth.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to facilitate for them because it's not happening in practice. And if we only have one more placement block, then we can give them intrapartum experience, but we can't say what they're going to experience during that placement block.
Yeah.
So if that sounds negative.
No. But I think the actual real nitty gritty of how this would work would have to be really discussed and unpicked. And I've suggested to the LMEs that they would have start a group to start beginning to explore some of this, so that some of these things will sort of you know, come out. And I think the issue about the reasonable adjustments is really interesting, because I think we've got to be very careful about what we're talking about with reasonable adjustments for disability and then actual flexible working, because you know, there may be some unrealistic expectations of what can be provided reasonably to people, particularly if it's not for disability. I'm very conscious of time, Ricky, so I suppose the next steps is very happy to return, because I'm conscious that we've raised some issues with you. The other thing I haven't mentioned is that we are talking a little bit about length of programme again, the possibility of internships, that will be across nursing and midwifery. So, do we just need, a different approach? Do we need to be brave, bearing in mind all of these sort of challenges? So lots to talk about. We will continue to do our practice learning webinars. We're working a little bit under pressure because this has got to go to council in November, and I'm taking it up to a more national level in September, because the CMIDOs, the education and training leads, like workforce training and education, HEIW for Wales and the other equivalents, we'll be talking to our midwifery strategic advisory group about this, as well as HOMS-DOM students. But I think the most important thing to think about is that once we make some recommendations, we'll then need to do a lot of engagement thereafter before we sort of go towards potentially the public consultation.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Yeah, absolutely. I think a follow-up session would be great. We'll send out the slides, the recording. We've put our details in the chat. So send myself or Jackie any more feedback. And thank you all for coming today. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Laurie. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.